It's time to panic, it's time to freak out, and it is time to stay up all night and worry about your recordings being stored, reviewed, and even handed to contractors. I am, of course, kidding. Hello automators, thanks for tuning in again. All three of the big companies here in home automation have been exposed for handing your recordings to contractors for the purposes of review. First it was Amazon, then it was Google, and now finally Apple has been exposed for really the same business model. What does this mean for you, and should you be concerned? That's what we're going to talk about today. There are a few components to consider when we talk about this. The first is what's being kept and for how long. As I've gone through and reviewed the different reports here, one thing stands out immediately to me, and that's how the different companies are handling the information that you allow them to keep. So these are the recordings we're going to talk about today. Google and Apple really, what you allow them to keep is what they keep and what they use. Now, going forward with Amazon, what they've actually said is that they keep your recordings no matter what you do. So I'm not too sure what the deletion or the recording deletion function is when you're asking one of their devices to actually delete your recordings. I'm not sure anymore what that is for. As it relates to Google, they're now giving you the ability to go ahead and erase recordings on a regular basis. So 3 or 18 months, that's how long your recordings will sit out there for. So this is a big differential, and it really ensures that your data is only kept for as long as you'd like. So when we talk about what data is being kept here, I think it's pretty safe to assume that we need to push for more control, and I especially think it's required that Amazon has taken to task for telling you they're deleting the recordings but then not, and we obviously need to push for that level of control there with these devices. Regardless, I believe this new technology, and that's what voice assistants are, they're a relatively new technology. I believe they're headed for regulation in a lot of countries, and without going into all of the details of the GDPR regulation in the EU, I can tell you that these companies will have to be very, very careful to not break that regulation, and there's probably already some areas where they've had to make significant adjustments, and if they are breaking that regulation, well, then they're going to get fined. In fact, there's a very specific clause called the right to erasure on the GDPR that Amazon would not be able to keep your recordings at that point. So they have to be very, very careful with a clause like that or with a section like that in regulation. Leaving regulation alone, because that's going to take time to get implemented or created even in many countries, then implemented, and then on top of that, you're going to have to enforce and fine these companies and have them then adjust. So there's going to be this real adjustment period for all of this kind of new regulation that probably has to come. So we need to move on and talk more about the other component, or what I think is more the real danger. The reason I say that is there are recordings that are happening as we're just sitting here. These devices could be triggering. Now, I haven't seen any or heard any, and usually I have the audible response on my devices to hear that, but those kinds of triggers are what we're hearing more and more about in the news. See, it's one thing to request a voice assistant to help you and then have the company know what you ask. Great. Google knows that last night I played the new Black Keys album. They also know I shut off my lights at 11 like I always do, and they know a few other things that I've requested from the device. Great, what do I care? In the words of Happy Gilmore, gold jacket, green jacket, who gives a sh? But it's a whole other thing to have a voice assistant trigger because I said, hey, or Gecko, or Alyssa, And it's a whole other issue when I'm just walking around my house, I'm playing music, I'm speaking to someone on the phone, and these devices trigger, and then they're recording. And what we're reading on all of these reports is it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll being recorded by these devices and then being handed to these contractors. So we clearly have a problem, but what can be done? Now, normally I would think that most of us wouldn't care about this happening every so often, but the fact is that information is being passed along with these issues or these audio recordings that are going to contractors and going to different people in the organization. So that's really the concern from the people who are kind of blowing the whistle on these companies and saying, hey, I can actually go and identify a person if I want. Now, there's a reason for that, and I'll explain. See, the companies are trying to diagnose an issue, and unfortunately, that means that in a lot of cases, you need some extra information there. So, for example, if there's a specific dialect, and I think of Newfoundland here in Canada, we call them Newfies, and they have a totally different way of speaking than us Albertans out here. And the fact of the matter is sometimes I can't understand what they're saying. And so imagine one of these products trying to adjust to that dialect. And in countries like India, there are many dialects, many languages. And so you have to geolocate issues. You have to, unfortunately, profile people a little bit in order to get the devices to work correctly and to understand people more and more. There is one thing that you can count on no matter what. These companies have to abide by the terms and conditions. Now, they can change those terms and conditions, but you don't have to accept them. When you accept those terms and conditions, you're agreeing to a set of rules that you will abide by and that they will abide by. And those terms and conditions are usually very one-sided, but again, there's regulation in place that these companies have to follow and has to be part of those terms and conditions. So, with that in mind, you have to think about what you've agreed to and then think about what these contractors would then have to agree to. See, they have to abide by those same terms and conditions. If somebody at a contracting company, it's easy to say, oh, contractors are bad, they're terrible, blah, blah, blah. Google shouldn't be doing that. But the thing is, these contractors have to abide by those same terms and conditions. So if somebody reaches out and they contact you because they heard sex, drugs, and rock and roll on the recordings, well, they've broken those terms and conditions, and trust me when I say they are going to have a very bad day. What do you think, automators? Is it time to panic? Do we just need to continue to push these companies for more control, more regulation? What do we need in the end, and can we win the privacy battle with these kinds of devices in our homes? Until next time, guys, remember not to hate.